In this third and final discussion of Chapter 8 on skeletal muscle, we'll investigate several factors that influence the tension produced during muscle contraction. We ended Section 2 with the remark that the type of exercise induces changes or adaptations in the muscle that promote the transition of muscle fibers into the type that's being called for by the exercise. In other words, if we do aerobic exercise in which we're calling upon endurance fibers, type 1 fibers, we're using aerobic respiration for long duration exercise, the muscle will begin to respond by morphing muscle fibers to become more like type 1 fibers. In other words, type 2X and type 2A fibers will start shedding some actin-myosin, producing more mitochondria. Blood capillaries will start to grow in at a higher density. Myoglobin will be synthesized. All the things that would improve the efficiency of a muscle cell in an aerobic energy-producing scheme. Whereas resistance exercise or weightlifting tends to induce the lighter type 1 fibers to bulk up, add more actin and myosin filaments, more myofibrils, reduce the number of mitochondria, and jettison the myoglobin, it's an oxygen-binding protein, don't need it. These cells do anaerobic glycolysis during contraction, and they do have mitochondria so that they can recover from exercise. They have EPOC, and they do convert the lactic acid back into pyruvic acid and send it into the mitochondria ultimately. But they're anaerobic, big, strong, fast anaerobic fibers, and that's what we wind up with when we do weightlifting, and the muscles will hypertrophy, we get larger. A couple of terms associated with muscle contractions. When we're talking about dynamic exercise, in other words, contractions in which the length of the muscles are changing, concentric is the term used to describe a contraction in which the muscle length is decreasing. Eccentric is the name of an exercise or a change in muscle length that's increasing. Static exercise is equivalent to isometric exercise. No change in the length of the muscle. Plenty of tension may be produced, but there's no change in muscle length. Here's a little illustration of a concentric contraction, shortening this biceps muscle. Eccentric contraction, lengthening it as we extend the forearm once again. And then isometric. This is meant to be a bar attached to the wall or some other fixture so it can't move. All right. A muscle twitch is a single stimulation and the tension that's produced. In other words, if we send one burst of acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction, receptor channels will open, action potentials will momentarily shoot across the muscle cell membrane down into the T-tubules. Calcium will be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Cross bridges will cycle, and then, very quickly, the acetylcholine release will end. It'll be destroyed in the synapse by acetylcholine esterase. Calcium will be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Troponin and tropomyosin will return to their resting state, and cross bridges will not be able to attach. So that'll produce one little blip of tension. The speed with which that takes place depends on the muscle fiber type. If we observe a muscle twitch in a muscle that's composed mainly of type 2X fibers, then we'll see a very short duration of the twitch. The entire twitch, building up tension and relaxing again, will happen in just a few milliseconds, whereas in a muscle where there's mostly type 1 fibers with slower myosin ATPase activity and slower release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the twitch will take much, much longer, maybe 100 or more milliseconds to complete the muscle twitch. Everything happens more slowly in type 1 fibers, more quickly in type 2X fibers. Just to remind you, here's a little schematic of the cross-bridge cycle. Here we have taken a myosin head that's in the resting position and hydrolyzed an ATP. It's an enzyme which uses the energy to spring load this head into a cocked position, and then it can then bind to the actin. Then immediately it rotates and does work, the power stroke, and then as ATP binds, it dissociates, and then hydrolyze ATP back into the COX position. So round and round we go, as long as there's calcium present. And that's what generates this tension, right? This is a representation of one muscle twitch. There's actually a latent period associated with muscle twitches, right? We stimulate the muscle right here, and we don't have tension until 10 milliseconds later. That's because it takes time to produce the action potential, sweep across the membrane down into the T tubules, release the calcium, bind to troponin, move the tropomyosin, and cross bridges begin to cycle, and there's some elastic elements. The muscle cell isn't just composed strictly of actin and myosin, so for a little while as the actin and myosin filaments slide, we're stretching some very soft elastic elements until they, when you stretch a rubber band, the more you stretch it, the tighter and stiffer it gets. That's what's happening here. Some elastic elements finally get stiff enough to start producing some tension on the tendons and the muscle. Here are some factors affecting muscle tension. And we'll take a look at each one in turn. Wave summation, which refers to the frequency of stimulation. Higher frequency of motor neuron stimulation of a muscle cell produces more tension. Recruitment, activation of more motor neurons, and therefore more muscle cells, produces more tension. Muscle length. There's an ideal muscle length at the point of stimulation that will produce the maximum tension. And contractile history. It's good to warm up. We'll produce more tension with the same amount of stimulation if we warm up. And then eventually we'll reach the point of fatigue when tension will reduce. All right, wave summation. Increasing frequency of stimulation increases the tension that muscle cells produce. If we just stimulate once, we get a muscle twitch. If we then stimulate in rapid succession, the tension will increase with each successive stimulation until we reach some peak tension called tetanus. Tetanus is just the maximum tension a muscle cell can produce, or muscle cells, and that's exactly how we use muscle cells, at their maximum tension. The underlying mechanism is a buildup of calcium concentration in the sarcoplasm. Every time we successively stimulate the muscle cell, more calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it adds to what was still left in the cytoplasm or sarcoplasm, and we just keep adding more calcium. More cross bridges cycle until we get all the cross bridges cycling at once, and then that's when we reach tetanus. No more tension can be produced. So again, that's how we turn on muscle cells. It's not how we control tension, it's how we turn them on. We ramp them up to maximum tension through this, so it's not a jerky thing. It's a nice smooth ramping up to tension as we do wave summation. Here's a graphical illustration. If we just stimulate the muscle with a great period of time in between, sufficient time for all the calcium to be pumped back into the SR, then we'll get the same exact amount of tension each time. But if we stimulate at higher frequency, so that not all the calcium can be pumped back in the SR before another shot of calcium comes out, calcium builds up, we get more troponins bound, more tropomyosins moved, more cross bridges cycling, and more tension. Once we reach peak tension, that's called tetanus, and that's how we operate muscle cells. They're either off, or we ramp them up to peak tension until we're done, and we release them and they relax. The way we actually regulate the tension as desired in a muscle contraction is by what's called recruitment. We vary the number of muscle cells involved in the contraction. A low tension contraction just involves fewer muscle cells within the muscle. Muscle cells scattered throughout the muscle will be contracting, but if we need more tension, we'll activate more muscle cells throughout the muscle, and we'll get more force therefore. A motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the muscle cells that it innervates. Let's look at this cartoon diagram. Look at the purple motor neuron, right, in the spinal cord here. It's activated by the motor cortex. An upper motor neuron would come down here and synapse with this lower motor neuron. And when that motor neuron fires, these two muscle cells contract. That's what it always does. Whenever it's called upon, these two muscle cells are activated. And they're ramped up to full tension to tetanus by wave summation. If that's not enough tension, we'll recruit another motor unit, another motor neuron and all of its muscle cells, its group of muscle cells. So now we have 5 muscle cells contracting because the first 2 are still online. We just ramp up 3 more muscle cells to maximum tension, to tetanus. And now we have more tension. So that's what's meant by recruitment. Increasing tension by activating more motor units. Spooky, I'm in the middle of a muscle. The muscle length. If you stimulate a muscle at its ideal length, an intermediate length, it'll produce the most tension. If you lengthen the muscle first, like extend your forearm all the way out to 180 degrees and then stimulate the muscle, it'll produce less tension. If you bunch up the muscles, can flex your muscle first, then see how much tension it produces, it'll produce less tension at that shorter initial length. So the maximum tension is produced at some ideal intermediate muscle length. Actually, the geometry of the bones around the joint also impacts the amount of tension produced at the wrist or at the hand during that tension of that bicep muscle, but the muscle itself produces more tension at an intermediate length. Here's a little explanation of that. There's an ideal length in which the most cross bridges will be activated when you stimulate the muscle. At an intermediate length, all of the myosin heads are in the juxtaposition of some actin filaments, and when we move the tropomyosin, we get the most cross bridges. If we stretch out the muscle before contraction, you can see this exaggerated picture that some of the myosin heads have no actin to bind to until they can sort of walk those actins in towards the center of the sarcomere and get to this maximum tension production. Here we see the tension produced 100% of maximum. If we also bunch up the sarcomeres before we contract the muscle or stimulate the muscle, can't produce quite as much tension. The contractile history, how does that influence tension? Well, it turns out that if you warm up a muscle, it produces more tension with each successive stimulation. Even if you wait for all the calcium to be pumped away in between each stimulation, warming up the muscle will increase the tension. It's called post-activation potentiation. Potentiation just means an increase in something, bringing into being an increase. Here's a cartoon representation. Cartoon graph showing that if we stimulate the muscle when it's cold, we'll produce some tension. And as we can keep on stimulating that muscle in exactly the same way over and over, more and more tension will be produced as heat is liberated from the ATPs, from the cross-bridge cycling, and that warms up the muscles. Enzymes just work more quickly at higher temperatures, and so everything is happening more quickly. More cross-bridges are cycling, the myosin ATPase is quicker, energy production is quicker, everything. More tension. With aging, there's a loss in muscle tension. With age, muscle cells are slowly replaced with collagen. Muscle cells die and the collagen fibers, scar tissue essentially, replace the muscle cells so that it looks like a muscle, but it's becoming less and less like a muscle as there's less contractile elements. And you can see this ominous statement. 10% of muscle mass lost between age 25 and 50. I can tell you 50 is not an old age. And you don't like to see things like that. 40% more lost between 50 and 80. Don't let that happen. We need to exercise, exercise, exercise. You can delay this age-related loss of muscle. There's plenty of quantitative studies showing that we can circumvent this loss in muscle quite a bit by continuing with an exercise habit. It turns out also as we age, more and more slow fibers are represented in the muscle. They sort of are sustained for a longer period of time. So slow fibers produce less specific tension. We have less strength. Some diseases impact muscles and muscle tension. Diabetes mellitus, that should say, I should edit that. Diabetes mellitus is a disease in which, among other things, we activate hormones that will cause us to break down protein in the muscles and release it as amino acids, ostensibly for energy production, because the cells can't take up glucose, and so we'll have less and less actin and myosin filaments, less cross bridges, less muscle tension, and so muscles are being robbed of the proteins. It includes the heart. The heart muscle gets weaker and weaker over the course of this disease. Diabetes mellitus, a terrible, terrible disease. Many other terrible things happen as well. It is recommended that people with diabetes mellitus be in intimate contact with a trainer of some kind who can prescribe an exercise plan for them that's suitable for them, that won't get them into trouble metabolically, but that will stave off some of this loss of muscle mass by producing adaptation in muscles. Cancers. Cancer cells are super metabolically active. They're way more metabolically active than any normal cells in your body. They hog so much energy so that energy production demands will result in hogging protein from everywhere. Cachexia is a fairly massive loss of body mass as all of the resources are being called in for energy production because of these cancer cells absorbing so much of the fuels from the blood as they metabolize. Exercise can counteract cachexia, and in fact, exercise can actually inhibit tumor growth. If you have cancer, there are many things that your oncologist will prescribe for you in order to try to control the cancer, or in some ways possibly even cure the cancer. But what you can do that's very effective, the only thing you can actually do really, is exercise, and it really does have an impact both on the cancer progression and on the maintenance of your normal healthy tissue in your body for longer. Muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy is a whole bunch of different progressive degenerative muscle diseases. So there's loss of muscle fibers, scarring, and weakness that results from these diseases. Different ones have different ages of onset and affect different parts of the body predominantly. Probably the most famous one you've heard of is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a fatal childhood disease in which there's a missing cytoskeletal protein in muscle cells, so that activation of muscle contraction tears the muscle cells, and so every time you stimulate a muscle, you wind up with injury and scarring of the muscles, eventually leading to muscle weakness and death. The force-velocity relationship. It's a fairly self-evident thing, but nevertheless, you should take a look at it. The greater the load you place on the muscle, the lower the maximum velocity that can be produced. In other words, think of lifting something very, very heavy. You can't move the muscle at the same rate or contract at the same rate as when there's something light. So, excuse me, if we load up the muscle more and more, we're going to wind up with less and less velocity, right? Higher load, and moving to less and less velocity. In other words, let's go from this load at, let's say, 50% maximum load, and this is our velocity right over the V. If we go up to 75% maximum load, here's the maximum velocity, half of that. So we have a lot less velocity as we add load. Eventually, at some point, there is zero movement. There's some load that we just can't lift, and that will produce zero velocity of movement. Muscle power relationship. There's an ideal speed of contraction of any particular muscle that will produce the maximum amount of power. Muscle power increases as velocity increases up to a point, but then it starts to decline again. So here's a graphical representation of the power produced in a muscle contraction at various speeds of contraction. So here you can see there's a sweet spot right in here between 200 and 300 degrees per second of skeleton movement through muscle contraction. So it isn't necessarily true that the faster you go, the better you will be in terms of a competitive athletic activity. There's some sweet spot where you're being most efficient, you're producing the most power, and that's exactly what you want to do. So that's the end of our discussion of muscle physiology, and I hope you'll take some time and review the first two sections of this chapter as well.